Hi there. Last week we looked at how Jesus was not distracted by presenting issues in another person's life, but really focused more on an individual and who they were, and shows through her how we can discover a new way to live when Jesus' love is real to us and our love is real to others. Now, since that incident, which is way back in John chapter 4, we land ourselves in the end of John chapter 6, and this incident really is a conversation after an awkward moment, and Jesus unpacked a lot of stuff in different ways between now and then, and more people were following. But then when more and more people realised what was involved on this whole message and that there were some serious challenges, well, those serious challenges resulted in more people just leaving. So here we have just listened into a conversation of the aftermath of largely a walkout from what Jesus had been teaching. Have you ever actually been in an awkward meeting? There's been a reaction maybe to something that's said, and someone actually takes an offence, not to something maybe personally said about them, but about a person they care about and are loyal to. Sometimes they seem more offended than the person who the comment was intended for. And there's a challenge with such a reaction, as it can make it a bigger problem. Jesus sensed that in the 12 followers and was quick to remind his followers so that they could stay on task. So we have just listened to the story as told by John that showed Jesus and his followers were at a tipping point, and tensions were building up, and it was that kind of watershed moment, and that reveals this kind of awkwardness. Now, as the early church was hearing the dynamics described at this point between Jesus and his immediate followers, they would relate to that well, and how the early church had begun to grow but also divide. Starting well, but then hitting problems. They offer the best thing ever, and some people dare to reject it. And they're saying, what's going on? However, they would listen to this story and they would understand that these people would fall away from what they initially were interested in and go back to their old ways. Now, Jesus challenges his followers' reaction to the majority leaving. Now, Jesus' immediate disciples like Peter and John had reached a point of no return really, and they were all in, and there was really no option of going back. Jesus was reflecting that back to them, and he knew they had no choice, but it didn't mean they were in a position to judge those who still have a choice. So the conversation would teach the early church not to be so judgmental about others making such choices. It could be we have come off the back of, say, like a pandemic, and it has hit the church, and maybe the attendance across Scotland has not just been a slow leak, but it's now a burst pipe. It's a scenario for many awkward conversations right across Scotland. When someone works hard at something and it goes well, and it does so for a while, and then something falters, those who are organising can be sensitive and maybe take offence for all the personal investment that's taken place. So we need to ask, where does our offence or their offence come from? Because to be offended may be understandable, but it reveals maybe an attitude that's lost its roots to what it's valued. Being offended and something being offensive are kind of two different things, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here, because so when something's offensive, there's probably a common understanding of that. But when there's someone who's been offended and it's a much more personal thing, then we need to ask, why is that happening? And one reason is the emotional investment, where we're managing our own expectations and the expectations we place upon others. We expect someone to do or be something and they do not match up to it because we expect it of ourselves. We learned from these disciples that they had come to a point where they were falling and there was no choice. And they were annoyed at others. They felt they should have stayed, and leaving was unjustified. Now, maybe so, but how these people reach their decision is one thing, and that's their responsibility, but how we react is our responsibility. And the danger with expectation is that we transfer that sense of responsibility and ownership onto others. And it's understandable, but it's off-putting because the way it comes across is annoyance and impatience. It's like organising a birthday party for your friend and no one decides to come. We can feel embarrassed but also offended, and we can show that offence by our annoyance, our behaviour, our harsh words, and we can just be in a foul mood. Now, the person who's there, whose birthday it's for, has to come for us because of the way we're reacting. I suppose that's what's going on in our story at the moment. It happened in the early church and in the New Testament. We see it littered with incidences where things are not handled well. It happens today between churches and within churches, and historically we're left with masses of denominations littered across Scotland. It's dividing energy. People are leaving the church over arguments. We could be working hard to get things off the ground, and it can become easily annoying that we are not rewarded with a kind of reciprocal response from other members. It's the same at work maybe as well, or in the home. A nice meal is not thanked for. A project is handed in, the boss doesn't acknowledge it. But our reaction can fuel the problem, and it can make it a bigger problem. See, Jesus is teaching us to nip that attitude in the bud by asking, what is the motivation for being so offended? It doesn't come from a good place. And that's one problem, but then there's a really awkward part of the story where there's something worse than that, and even darker, when someone does stick around. In our story, it's Judas, who is one of the 12, which means he's one of the close disciples, but he's also known and put up front here as the betrayer. In other words, there's almost a side note in our story too that really says this as well, just to give people the heads up. And it's really quite specific. It says, Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So this element in the story would be a challenge in the early church, that there were those who didn't want to leave but would stay and manipulate the group. Again, we see it again in the New Testament. People are hurt, troublemakers, giving others a tough time. As John recounts the Jesus story for the church to learn, he calls this incident and alerts the church that Jesus faced the same issue. The church would be the same. Indeed, it happens today, where individuals stay within a church and in their sad, probably sorry and sadistic way, if they are not called out, they can cause havoc and hurt. And as they hone their art of betrayal, it doesn't just happen in the church, it can happen in work, it can happen in the home, it can happen in relationships. So why on earth does Jesus not just get rid of Judas there and then? Well, likely the story here gives us the benefit of hindsight. The community gives chances to chancers. Mercy gives a chance and does not prejudge. Saying that at the moment kind of annoys me, because I maybe have to work that through too, like everyone else. Did Judas realise himself at that point? Maybe not. He might have felt conflicted inside, but maybe he did not know where it was going to take him. Maybe we can have tendencies like that too, but I don't believe in fate, so it doesn't need to mean that can't change direction. I don't believe in a kind of predetermined path, that there is no way out. We can recognise something in ourselves and allow God to see it and change it. However, if left unattended, the person will not just want Christianity on their terms, but they'll need everyone else to be like them and for the group to be manipulated to be on their terms. And it can come across in certain ways. They could quietly and insidiously gossip, badmouth other people, cause conflict and argument, or overtly bully in the group. Why do they do that? They may only trust themselves. Maybe they've been hurt in the past. And these choices have caused their world to shrink. They've lost their imagination. They've lost God's vision and replaced it with their own. And they can become a sneaky piece of work. And sadly, people get duped, hurt and sucked in by such people. It happened to Jesus' followers. It is a surprise that Jesus doesn't really call out completely there and then, but then hindsight is a wonderful thing. And even though Jesus is indicated he knew something was up and maybe it needed to be dealt with, we do have the benefit of hindsight. And maybe they need to see where it goes, to see how it turns out. So the early church had to be prepared to be disappointed, because the many would go away. The disenchanted would disappear off the scene. Jesus knew that that would happen. And the early church was also to be wary that some individuals with a sadistic urge to create a selfish world around them and using the church to do so was also a possibility. Why does God put up with that? Maybe it is that God puts up with all of us and we're all having to work it all out and the choices we make. And we probably have experienced this to varying degrees, whether it's in church, whether it's with a group of friends, in a local club, or at work. Those frustrations that we have to deal with, of that fringe interest, or that harder to handle individual who has that dark art of making misery of everyone, whether they mean it or not. Now, if these are the dynamics that happen in groups, how are we to deal with it? Oh, well, Jesus gives us some clues and we can take them on board for ourselves. First, he doesn't fight for those already leaving. They've already made up their mind and they're walking with their feet. Secondly, he challenges the committed, what John calls the 12. Do you not want to leave too, do you? It's a testing time. Sometimes we need to be asked explicitly why we get offended by other people's choices. And it's because we don't feel so free to do so. And so Peter's reaction is an interesting and honest one. And he really says, well, what choice do we have? It was not like, well, I'm really in for this, or I'm really up for this. It is what it is, and you're stuck with us. Sometimes life is like that. At certain points, it's not always that high-powered positivity. It's more like, well, let's look around at each other and we begin to realise that, well, this is it, and this is what we've got, and let's get on with it. The third reaction that Jesus has is to call out the motivation to stay. Some walk the same path, but have other plans, and their plan of manipulation starts up hidden, but will end up being painful, and sometimes they don't even realise it themselves, even people like Judas. They eventually get stuck, and there seems to be no going back. They may be troubled souls, and they don't know how to work out properly, But it's remarkable that Jesus still includes him as part of the community. And sometimes God's people are not the best bunch. And sometimes we're the best of a bad bunch. But that's how far God's love goes. It does not get rid of the bad people who choose to stay, whatever the reason or motivation. God's people can be a mixed bunch and a work in progress. The fact that Jesus voiced it at this point was to alert the group that the individual was part of their group, which might have been a shock. You see, the story would stop the church being naive and thinking that, well, they need to be part of a perfect group. Really, they had to contend with the thought that they could have a bad apple in the bunch. A time would come to deal with it, but it wasn't at this point in the story. And it might make people wary, but the wariness was not reaching a point where they had to deal with it. I don't know the full story of your church, but I wouldn't be surprised that you've had a fair share of more of what's going on in your church, where people have come along but have also gone away, and you've had a fair share of that. Or you've got the committed few who've stuck it for years, if not decades, and sometimes it feels a lot more like duty than delight, and not much choice. And then there's the other things that are going on, where there's individuals that you've journeyed with, who you've given a chance, but it's been at a cost. You see, the point is, Jesus knows that's what we are like, and how we as a group behave towards each other, and not just as individuals. Whether we mean it or not, the dynamics may not look pretty. But you see, even here, Jesus battles through. The early church had to battle through the same as well. Relationships can go through rough patches, and sometimes you've got to just muddle through. And we can become older and wiser as a result, and we may have the battle scars to show it. But remember this: we follow a scarred Saviour, a lacerated Lord, a crucified Christ, for a community of chancers who get a second chance.